$40. Anybody? 40 for the gray? The barn laughed. Buck Sievert leaned on the rail and called out, loud enough for every man in Fulton to hear. She's blind, son. You're bidding on meat by the pound. Isaiah Cole was 19. He had exactly $40 in his pocket, and he raised his hand anyway. That night, washing the mud off her neck, his rag caught on something. He stopped. He wiped again, slower. There was a brand under there, a broken crown. And burned right across the bottom of it at an angle was a second brand somebody had set down on top of the first. Marks don't fade like that. Marks get covered.
What was somebody hiding on a $40 horse?
In Callaway County, Missouri, the horse business ran on a rule so old that nobody bothered saying it out loud anymore. Buy the best mare you can afford. Breed her to the best stallion you can afford. Sell the foal, and let the quality of your stock decide the ceiling on everything else. It was not a secret, and it was not complicated. It was simply what a person did if he raised quarter horses in that part of the state. And by the winter of 1987, the men who did it well had been doing it well for 3 generations, on land their fathers had cleared, in a county where a family name was a kind of currency. A blind mare had no place in that arithmetic. She could not be ridden or shown or resold. She could not be trusted to find her own water in a strange pasture. In the language of the sale barn, she was a cull, and culls were bought by the pound or not bought at all. Isaiah Cole was 19 years old and lived with his grandmother on 12 acres at the end of a gravel road that the county graded twice a year and forgot about the rest of the time. The land had been in the family since his great-grandfather, and what remained of it was an old timber barn with a sagging roof, a small pole corral the old man had built himself and nobody had taken down, a few acres of pasture gone thin from years of nothing running on it, and a house that Ruth Cole kept clean the way some people keep a promise. There had not been horses on that place in Isaiah's lifetime. What he had instead was an eye, and he had gotten it the way most people in that county got theirs, which was from a father. Marcus Cole had been head groom at Blackwood Acres, and for the first 12 years of Isaiah's life, that meant the boy spent his summers inside barns that smelled of cedar shavings and saddle soap, learning without being told he was learning. His father would stop him in an aisle and point with his chin at an animal standing at the end of it, and Isaiah was expected to say something true about it. Not something clever, something true. How the shoulder was set, whether the horse carried its weight forward or back, whether its breathing changed when a door opened. Marcus never explained why any of it mattered. He only kept asking until the answers got better. By the time Isaiah was 10, his father had stopped asking questions and started handing him work. And some of that work happened at 2 in the morning in a foaling stall with a lantern hung on a nail. Blackwood Acres had been one of the great operations of central Missouri, and the reason was a stallion named Dominion's Promise, who threw speed and stamina onto his foals and, more valuable than either, through temperament. His get were calm. They did not waste themselves. Breeders 3 states away paid for that calmness because it could not be trained into an animal that had not been born with it. Then, in 1980, Elias Blackwood died, and the manner of his death was still argued about in the county in a low voice. A fire went through the broodmare barn that same season. The operation came apart inside a year, and it came apart badly. Breeding records went missing. The band was scattered through 4 sales in 3 states. When the dust settled, the registry showed no surviving mare carrying the direct female line off that stallion, and the men in the business filed the whole thing away as a thing that had ended. Marcus Cole worked other places after that, and none of them were the same, and 2 years later he died in a loading accident at a feed operation outside Fulton. Isaiah was 14. What his father left him was a wooden box with a lid warped so it never sat flush. Inside were photographs curling at the corners, 3 loose pages torn out of a breeding log in a hand Isaiah recognized before he could read it, and 1 sentence Marcus had said often enough that his son had stopped hearing it as advice and started hearing it as a fact about the world. "A horse's worth," Marcus told him, "is not in the paper somebody lets her keep." By 1987, Isaiah was sweeping floors and washing instruments at Dr. Arnold Huber's veterinary clinic in town for $3 an hour. Huber had done large animal work in Callaway County for 21 years and had a habit of tossing his professional journals into the paper bin the week after they came because his waiting room was small and the stack got away from him. Isaiah started carrying them home. Nobody had told him he was allowed to, and nobody had told him he wasn't. And after the first few months, Huber began setting them on the corner of the desk instead of throwing them out, which was as close as that man came to encouragement. The other thing Isaiah carried was a notebook. It rode in the back pocket of his coat, and it had been through 2 winters and a river of sweat, and it held weights and dates and prices and things men had said, written down in a small, square hand. He had never once explained to anybody why he kept it. Ruth Cole had lived long enough to know exactly what the world thought her grandson was worth, and she was hard enough not to let him believe the number. She did not tell him the world was fair. She told him to be twice as sure as the man arguing with him, and to write things down. And then there was Buck Sievert, who was 54 years old and ran 280 acres and 40 brood mares north of the River Road, and who had been raising quarter horses in that county for 30 years. He knew every bloodline that came through the local ring. He was not a cruel man. He was a certain man, and in Callaway County in 1987, those two things could be very difficult to tell apart. To Buck Sievert, the idea of a 19-year-old black kid holding an opinion about breeding was funny in exactly the same way that breeding a blind mare was funny, and he would not have understood why anyone found either remark unkind. In the coffee can on the kitchen shelf that March, there were $200. $160 of it was the tax money, wrapped separately in a rubber band, and it was not his. $40 was. The sale barn sat on the north edge of Fulton behind a gravel lot that froze into ruts every winter and never quite thawed flat again. On the 10th of March, the second Tuesday of the month, the thermometer nailed to the office wall read 11 degrees, and the men inside kept their coats buttoned and their hands in their pockets and watched the ring through a haze of their own breath. Isaiah had come for a workhorse, something sound in the legs and dull enough in the mind to drag a harrow across the front pasture and pull brush out of the fence line. Ruth had not asked him to do it. She had only mentioned twice in a month that the pasture was going back to sumac, which in that house was the same as asking. He stood at the back rail with his collar up and let the good lots go by without lifting a finger. A stout bay gelding brought $425. A pair of matched sorrels brought more than he would earn in a year of sweeping the clinic. The men who bought them did not look up when they bid. They lifted 2 fingers off a rail and the auctioneer found them across 60 feet of noise because he had been finding them for 20 years. By 11 o'clock, the crowd had thinned to the men who stayed for the tail of the sale, and the auctioneer's voice had changed. It had gone flat and businesslike, the sound of somebody reading down a list whose ending he already knew. The last lot came in behind a handler who led her too fast, the way people lead an animal they have already stopped thinking about. She was a gray mare, 15 years old by the card, thin through the neck and ribby under a winter coat gone dull. Her legs were caked with mud to the hocks. A white film covered most of her left eye. The consignor's line was read out in a single breath. Grade mare, no registration papers, origin unknown, vision severely impaired, sold as is. Buck Sievert was standing near the front with his forearms on the rail, and he said, loud enough for the barn to hear him and without any malice in it at all, that the only honest bid on that one was by the pound. A few men laughed. The auctioneer opened her at $60 and nobody moved. He dropped to $50. He dropped to $40 and started talking faster, the way they do when they want a thing finished. But Isaiah had stopped listening to the ring. He was watching how she stood. Under the mud and the poor condition, the frame was right. She was deep through the girth, with a shoulder laid back at an angle his father would have made him name out loud, and hindquarters that still carried muscle no 15-year-old cull had any business carrying after a hard winter. That much a dozen men in the room could have seen if they had bothered to look past her eye. What none of them saw was the other thing. The barn was a hard place for a horse. Gates banged, a calf bawled behind the pens. The auctioneer's speaker crackled and cut. A nearly blind animal in that much noise should have been coming apart, head up, feet shifting, sweat breaking along her neck. This mare stood square in the center of the ring, with one ear tracking the auctioneer and the other tracking the gate she had come through. And she did not move. His father's voice arrived from somewhere 10 years back and said the word that mattered. Calm. Not trained into her, born into her. Then the handler pulled her around to face the other side of the rail, and she turned her neck, and the winter light came across the left side of it, and Isaiah saw a shape under the caked mud that was not mud. It was the top half of a mark, 2 points and a broken arc between them, like a crown with a piece missing out of the middle. He had been looking at that shape since he was 6 years old, in photographs curling at the corners inside a wooden box with a warped lid. His hand went up before he had made any decision he could later describe. The auctioneer took it, called it twice, and knocked her down at $40, and there was a beat of real quiet before the barn understood what had happened and began to laugh. It was not the laughter of men being cruel. It was worse than that. It was the laughter of men watching somebody step in a hole they had all clearly seen. Buck came down the rail and put a hand on Isaiah's shoulder on his way to the office, and he meant every word of it kindly. "Good luck, son," Buck said. In the office, a woman wrote the receipt out longhand with carbon paper under it. Gray mare, grade, no papers, $40, paid. She asked his name and he told her, and she wrote I. Cole, because that was all the line had room for. He had no trailer and no money left to hire one, so he walked her. It was 7 miles back to the gravel road, and it took most of the afternoon, and she never once balked or crowded him. She kept her shoulder at his elbow and her ears working, and let the road come to her a step at a time. Somewhere in the 4th mile, he decided to call her Grace. He washed her the next morning with water heated on the stove and carried out in a galvanized bucket, working down the neck with a rag while she stood loose-tied to the corral post and let him. The mud came off in sheets. What was underneath it did not make sense. The broken crown was there, faint and old, the hair grown back over it pale and wrong. But laid across the bottom third of it was a second mark, a heavier one, a shape with no meaning he could read, burned over the first at an angle. Brands faded, brands blurred as an animal aged and the hide stretched. Brands did not get another brand set down on top of them by accident. Somebody had wanted that crown gone. He left her standing and went into the house and brought the wooden box out to the kitchen table and laid the photographs across it in the order his father had kept them. Blackwood Acres in its last good years. A stallion standing square in front of a white barn with his head up and his ears forward, and men in the frame who were all dead or gone now. And in 3 of the pictures, a young gray filly held by a groom whose hands Isaiah knew before he recognized the rest of him, because they were his father's hands. The registry name was written on the back of one of them in pencil. Silver Mercy. He carried the photographs out to the corral and stood there a long time, going back and forth between the paper and the animal. The head carriage was the same. There was a slash of white above her eyes, high on the forehead, narrow at the top and wider at the bottom, and it was in the photograph, and it was in front of him. He ran his hand down her right hind and found a scar the length of his thumb where the picture said a scar ought to be. Silver Mercy had been the last daughter of Dominion's promise ever recorded, and every man in the horse business in central Missouri believed she had gone up in the barn fire of 1980. She would have been 8 years old that year. The mare standing in front of him was 15. If the arithmetic held, then the last living animal carrying the direct female line off that stallion had come through the Callaway County sale ring at the tail of a Tuesday morning and gone for $40. and 41 men had watched it happen. And Isaiah could prove none of it. What he owned was a handwritten receipt with a carbon under it that said, "Grade Mare, no papers," and a dead man's photographs that no registry on earth was obligated to look at. Ruth listened to all of it at the kitchen table that evening without interrupting once, which was her way. And when he finished, she reached up to the shelf and took down the coffee can and set it between them without opening it. "Blood typing costs money," she said. "So does a veterinarian. So does feed for an animal that eats every day, whether you've solved anything or not. And so does breeding her, which is the only way any of this becomes worth a nickel." She put 2 fingers on the lid. "There's 40 of yours in there, and there's the tax money, and the tax money is what keeps this ground in our name in December." Isaiah said he understood that, and he did. 5 days after the sale, Buck Sievert's truck came up the gravel and stopped in the yard, and Buck got out and looked at the mare over the corral rail for a while before he said anything. He had heard, he said, that Isaiah had been down at the courthouse asking about old Blackwood paperwork. It was a small county and that kind of thing traveled. Then he offered $75 for her. He was not being cruel about it. He said it plainly, as a favor he expected to be thanked for later. "Take the 75, he said, "and you're the only person in the history of this county to come out ahead on a blind mare, and the whole thing turns into a story you tell on yourself in 10 years. Isaiah thanked him and told him no. Buck shook his head once, got back in the truck and went down the road, and Isaiah stood in the yard until the dust settled, and then took the notebook out of his back pocket and wrote the date, and under it a single line. B. Sievert offered $75 for an animal he called meat by the pound 5 days ago. He looked at the number for a while. A man does not bid nearly double on something he believes is worthless. He bids that way when he has begun to wonder. The tax envelope stayed in the can. Isaiah did not sleep much that night, and what he decided somewhere before morning was not brave so much as narrow. He had one animal, one photograph, one notebook, and no leverage at all, and he was going to have to make those things be enough, because there was nothing else on the property. When he came out at first light, Ruth was already at the corral with a hammer in her hand. She had nailed 2 extra boards low along the bottom rail, close enough together that nothing small could roll under them. She did not say she believed him. She had reinforced a fence the way a person does when they are expecting a foal. The courthouse in Fulton kept what it kept, and what it kept about Blackwood Acres came to 4 thin folders and a bankruptcy docket. The breeding records were not in any of them. It took Isaiah 2 weeks of afternoons to learn where they had gone. When the estate was liquidated in 1981, the whole remaining paper of the operation, logs, stud books, foaling records, the identification photographs the registry required, had been bought in a single lot by a company out of Oklahoma called Sterling Bloodstock, along with whatever horses had not already been scattered. A clerk told him he could write and request copies. He wrote in his own hand on a sheet of tablet paper, and he was careful to explain exactly which mare he was asking about and why. The letter that came back 6 weeks later was 1 paragraph long and said that Sterling Bloodstock did not release proprietary records to third parties. The registry was simpler and colder. A mare could be recorded as the animal her papers said she was. Grace had no certificate, no identification photographs on file, and no chain of transfer showing how she had traveled from a barn that burned in 1980 to a sale ring in 1987. Without those, the association explained, there was nothing to restore. She was, in the only language that mattered to them, a grade mare of unknown breeding. So Isaiah did the only thing left, which was to go get money. He hired out that spring to anybody who would take him, mucking stalls, hauling manure, setting posts, stacking hay in other men's lofts 6 days a week and doing the clinic on the 7th. He came home in the dark and fed and wrote and slept and did it again. By the first week of April, there were $112 in a tin that was his and nobody else's, and the envelope in the coffee can had not been touched. Dr. Arnold Huber came out on a Saturday and spent an hour with the mayor and gave him the rest of the bad news. Progressive retinal degeneration, both eyes, the right one following the left. Within a year, Huber said, she would have no useful sight at all. Then he packed his bag and stood at the tailgate of his truck longer than a man needs to, and finally reached into the cab and came back with a stack of journals bound in a rubber band. Her eyes are finished, he said. Everything else about her is sound. Her reproductive system is as good as any mare I've had my hands on this year. He set the stack against Isaiah's chest. Before you decide anything, read that. Third one down. I marked it. The paper was 3 years old, out of the University of Missouri, published in a veterinary journal in 1984 by a researcher named Raymond Ellison. Ellison had followed 340 brood mares across 12 operations in 3 states over 6 years. 47 of those mares had some degree of vision loss, from partial impairment to total blindness. The sighted mares conceived on first cover 68 times out of 100. The impaired mares conceived on first cover 81 times out of 100. Foal survival to weaning ran 91% among the sighted mares and 97% among the blind ones. His proposed explanation took up half a page. A mare who cannot see is removed from the visual traffic of a herd, from the constant reading of rank and threat and position that a sighted animal never stops doing. Her stress hormones run lower through breeding and gestation, and a lower stress mare, measurably, reliably, settles more often and raises more of what she carries. Isaiah read it 3 times before he put the journal down. What he understood on the third reading was not about grace at all. Every sale barn in Missouri priced a mare by her eyes, and her eyes were real, and every one of them ignored what she could still do, which was also real. The gap between those 2 valuations had been sitting open for 3 years in a journal anyone in Callaway County could have pulled off a library shelf, and nobody in Callaway County had ever bothered. That was not a secret. It was worse than a secret. It was published, which meant the mare in his corral was not a lottery ticket. She was the first line of an argument. The argument still needed a stallion, and that was where the door closed. 3 owners turned him down inside of 10 days. The first was polite about it. The second explained at some length and with real conviction that he was not putting his horse over a blind mare because it went into his book, and his book was how he sold seasons. The third gave no reason at all. He looked at the tin Isaiah had brought with him, $112 in small bills, counted twice on his grandmother's table, and said his season was full. In March. Which was not a thing that happened. Isaiah wrote all 3 of them down. He did not write down what he thought the third one meant. He did not have to. It was Huber who broke it open, and he did it in the least dramatic way possible, by making a telephone call from the clinic and staying on the line 11 minutes. There was an old man out on Route B with a son of a well-regarded sire standing at $250, and he was behind on a note, and he had stopped caring very much what the county thought of his book. He took $50 down and the balance due when the mare was confirmed in foal, and he shook Isaiah's hand at the gate without any speech attached to it. The rest of that spring, Isaiah built the only thing he could afford to build, which was a place where a blind animal could be sure of herself. The corral fence came down to a low board line she could find with her chest before she found it with her legs. Nothing moved after that. Not a bucket, not a gate hook, not a pile of anything. He walked off the distance from the northeast corner post to the water trough with his own boots and wrote the number in the notebook so he could set it back exactly if it ever had to come out. Grace walked that fence line 17 times in the first 2 days. She stopped at every corner and stood and tested the ground with a 4-foot and filed it. On the 3rd morning, she came off the far rail at a trot with her head up and her ears working, and she did not check once. The notebook changed that spring, too. It had been a place where he put things men said. Now it became a record. Date, weight by tape, ration by the pound, temperature, water intake, every visit Huber made and every word he said about her. Every day. He did not miss a day that year or any year after, and at the time, he could not have told anyone why it mattered. By June, he had the 200, and he paid the old man on Route B in full, and the balance of what he earned that summer he put away without spending a dollar of it. And the story got to town before he did. Somewhere in April, it took a shape that traveled well, that the coal boy had invented a lost bloodline to sell a blind horse at a price, and that shape was easy to repeat. And men repeated it. The co-op in Fulton kept a counter along the back wall where the horsemen of Callaway County stood on Thursday afternoons to buy feed and trade information and confirm one another's opinions. And Buck Sievert held that counter the way another man holds a chair at the head of a table. Isaiah came in on a Thursday in the third week of April for a 50-pound sack of mare feed. Buck was there with Dale Crowley, who ran a small breeding operation on the north side of the county, and Greg Thornton, who had bought his father-in-law's place the year before and had not yet decided what to do with it. Buck was not a man who let somebody walk past him unacknowledged. He asked, and he asked with genuine curiosity, the way a physician asks a patient how the home remedy is coming along. "How's the blind mare?" Isaiah told him she was good, and that he had bred her 2 weeks ago to the horse out on Route B. The three men at the counter looked at one another. Then Buck Sievert started to laugh. It was not a mean laugh. That was the part Isaiah would remember longest. It was the honest laugh of a man who has heard something that is, by every standard he owns, objectively funny. Dale Crowley laughed with him. Greg Thornton studied the floor, which was the response of somebody not certain whether laughing was allowed and deciding the floor was safer. "You bred her," Buck said, "to sell the foal." Isaiah said that was right. "Son." Buck set his elbow on the counter and turned to face him, and he was not unkind even then. "You're going to lose that stud fee. You're going to lose the whole spring of work you put in getting it together. And you're going to learn something that costs a whole lot less to learn from a man who's already learned it. No offense meant." "There's research that says otherwise," Isaiah said. He had rehearsed the sentence in the truck of the man he had ridden in with, and it came out level. "What research?" Isaiah gave it to him whole. University of Missouri, Raymond Ellison, published in 1984. 340 mares, 12 operations, 6 years. Conception on first cover, 81% for impaired mares against 68 for sighted ones. Foal survival to weaning, 97 against 91. The counter went quiet, and the quiet was not agreement. Dale Crowley's face did something complicated. Greg Thornton looked up from the floor for the first time. What had stopped them was not the argument. It was that the argument had come out of that particular mouth, in that particular building, in that particular county, and none of them had a shelf to put it on. Buck put it on his shelf in 4 words. "A paper," he said, "from 1984. He said it the way a man closes a gate. Then he asked Dale something about hay, and the counter started up again around Isaiah as though a door had swung shut. Isaiah bought his feed and went home. That night he wrote the whole conversation into the notebook, as close to word for word as he could hold it. He underlined 30 years where Buck had said it. He underlined, "Lose that stud fee." Then he turned the page and wrote the date and Grace's weight and how much water she had taken, because that was the job. What had been settled at that counter was not really about a horse. Under the laughing, there was a question nobody in the room would have said out loud. And the question was, who is permitted to know things? In June, Isaiah drove 4 hours north to find the answer to a different question. He had gone through the 3 loose pages from his father's box more times than he could count. 2 of them were foaling entries, dated 1977 and 1978, written in Marcus Cole's small, careful hand, each one naming the same dam. On the 3rd page, sideways in the margin, was a name and a telephone number that no longer connected to anything. He found the man through a veterinary board directory at the county library. Walter Briggs had been the attending veterinarian at Blackwood Acres for 15 years, and he had retired to a small place near Mexico, Missouri, and he lived alone with 2 dogs and a garden he had let go. Briggs listened to the whole thing on his own porch without saying much. When Isaiah finished, the old man went inside and came back with his coat. He drove down the next morning. He did not look at the brand first, which surprised Isaiah. He put his hand flat on the mare's shoulder and let her find him, and he talked to her in a low voice while he worked back along her barrel. And then he crouched and ran his fingers along the underline of her belly, low and forward, and stopped. He stayed crouched there with his hand where it was. "There's a scar under here," Briggs said. "Crescent shape, about 4 inches." He looked up. "I put it there in 1973. She was a yearling and she had a hernia repair, and I did it myself in a stall because the trailer was broken down. And I have thought about that scar for 14 years because it is the sloppiest cut I ever made in my life." He stood up slowly, the way old men do. "This is Silver Mercy," he said. Then he walked around to her neck and looked at the mark on it, and his face changed. He touched the burned-over place with 2 fingers. "They didn't just lose her," Briggs said. "Somebody put a second iron on her." He was quiet for a moment, looking at that neck. "This mark has been on this animal for 7 years, son. She has been through 5 owners that I know of. Not one of them ever washed the mud off her neck and looked." That was the sentence Isaiah wrote down that night, and it was the sentence he would still be thinking about 14 years later. Briggs stayed 2 days. He had kept his own copies. A veterinarian's file was his file, he said, and no bankruptcy trustee in Oklahoma had ever asked him for it. Treatment records, identification numbers, 15 years of breeding dates in his own hand. He read his father's 2 torn pages twice and set them down and did not say anything about them at all. A bloodstock consultant out of Columbia came the following week for a fee Isaiah could not really pay, walked around the mare twice, and did the arithmetic out loud. If she settled, and if she was bred to a stallion with a record and not just a pedigree, a single foal off the last direct daughter of Dominion's promise would open somewhere north of $20,000. Carried forward through her get and their get and the stud seasons that would follow, he said, "You are talking about a line worth more than $1 million. Isaiah walked him back to his car and then stood in the yard and understood something that kept the number from turning his head. That $1 million did not exist for anybody else in the world. Not for Sterling Bloodstock, who had owned her papers for 6 years and had let the animal herself go through 5 sets of hands. Not for the 5 men who had owned her. Not for the auctioneer. A blind mare could not be ridden, shown, or resold, and no man in his right mind spent $250 putting a good stallion over one. The pedigree was only worth something to a person who believed she could still raise a foal. In the whole of Callaway County, there was exactly one person who believed that, and he believed it because of a journal somebody had thrown in a paper bin. Huber confirmed the pregnancy in the first week of June. She had settled on first cover. Isaiah wrote the number 81 in the notebook and drew a circle around it. The letter came in August on heavy paper with 3 names printed down the left margin. Sterling Bloodstock had purchased the entire remaining estate of Blackwood Acres in 1981, horses and records together, in a court-supervised sale. Any animal traceable to that estate remained, in their position, their property. They demanded the surrender of the mare and of any foal she might produce. There was a second paragraph. It was written carefully and said, in the mannered way that expensive language says things, that the circumstances by which a 19-year-old had come into possession of an animal of this significance were not yet clear to their client and would be a subject of inquiry. Isaiah read that paragraph 4 times. Then he sat down on the porch step and understood something that took the wind out of him worse than the letter had. The rumor had never needed to reach Oklahoma at all. He had mailed it there himself in April, in his own handwriting, on tablet paper, and he had been careful to explain exactly which mare he was asking about and why. He put the letter in the box with his father's photographs because that was where it belonged. He found a lawyer in Fulton named Curtis Ward who took $200 as a retainer, the summer's hay money, all of it, and who told him honestly what he was buying with it. Ward could answer the filing. He could argue a sale barn transaction was a valid transfer of title. What he could not do was outlast 3 attorneys on salary, and if the thing dragged past the spring, he would be working for nothing. And both of them should be clear about that now. Buck Sievert came up the gravel road for the second time in September. He did not go to the corral rail. He stood by his truck with his hat in his hand and looked at the barn roof, which was missing shingles along the north slope, and at the hay stacked under a tarp that was not big enough for it. His offer was $10,000 for the mare and every right to the foal she was carrying. He said the rest of it plainly because Buck Sievert did not know how to say things any other way. He said Sterling Bloodstock would spend more than $10,000 on lawyers before Christmas without noticing it, and that they would still be spending it in 2 years. He said Isaiah could hand him the halter that afternoon and pay the tax on the place and put a roof on the barn and set his grandmother up so she never had to think about a December again. He said one more thing before he left, and it was the closest that man came in that whole year to being generous. "I'm not trying to take her off you cheap," Buck said. "I'm trying to get you out of a fight you can't finish." Isaiah told him no. Ruth was on the porch and had heard all of it. She did not say anything about it at supper, and she did not say anything about it afterward. But at some point in the night, Isaiah came out for water and found her at the kitchen table with the coffee can open and the tax envelope in front of her, not counting it, only sitting with it under the light. $10,000 was not a temptation because it was a lot of money. It was a temptation because every single thing it would have fixed was real. The fall went hard after that. Isaiah worked out by day, hay, posts, a stretch of roofing on somebody else's barn, and came home to feed and to write. And after Grace was settled for the night, he sat with a kerosene lamp copying Briggs's records out longhand, because Ward said originals stayed with the man who made them, and copies had to exist in more than one place. By November, the county had stopped laughing at him, and what replaced it was worse. When he came into the feed store, men greeted him a little warmer than they used to. Their faces softened a half-degree. It was the particular warmth people extend to somebody they have decided is going to fail, and it followed him from the door to the register and back out again. He wrote that down too, in the same notebook, on the same kind of line as the water intake. In January, Huber came out and spent a long time with a light, and then packed it away and told him she was done. The right eye had gone the way of the left. There was no useful sight remaining in either. She was in her 10th month and carrying it hard. Her top line had dropped. She was eating what he gave her and holding weight only barely. Huber did not soften it. An aged mare, blind in this condition, foaling in a barn with no power to spare and no help within 20 minutes, there was a real chance of trouble at the end of it. The storm came in the last week of February out of the southwest. Warm rain on top of frozen ground, and then wind behind it. It took the north slope of the barn roof off in 2 pieces. It laid down 40 feet of the fence Isaiah had built board by board so that a blind animal could be sure of it. And it got under the tarp and into the hay, and by the time the rain quit, most of what was supposed to carry them into April was ruined. He stood in the mud in the gray light and did the arithmetic there was no way around. There was no money to fix the roof. There was no money for hay. There was no money for a difficult foaling. And Grace was due inside of 3 weeks. The order came out of the circuit court in Fulton on the 4th of March. Curtis Ward drove out to the place to deliver it rather than mail it, which told Isaiah what it was before the man had his car door open. Pending resolution of the ownership dispute, the mare known as Grace, together with any offspring produced by her, was subject to a freeze. She could not be sold. She could not be transferred. She could not be registered with any breed association. She could not be pledged as collateral for a loan of any kind. Ward went through it line by line at the kitchen table with Ruth listening from the stove, and then he set it down and told Isaiah what it actually meant, which the document itself never said anywhere. If that foal was born alive and sound, and if it was everything the consultant from Colombia thought it would be, Isaiah would own an animal worth more money than his family had earned in 3 generations. And he would not be able to trade it for a sack of feed. Ward also said that this was not an accident of procedure. A freeze cost Sterling Bloodstock nothing. It cost Isaiah everything, every month, and both sides understood that perfectly. 9 days later, a notice ran in 2 regional breeding journals. Sterling Bloodstock announced a limited offering of breeding rights in what the copy called the Restored Dominion's Promise Line. Seasons available for the following year. Inquiries welcome. They did not have the mare. They did not have a foal. They were selling the future of a bloodline they had not yet been awarded in print, where every serious breeder from Texas to Illinois would read it, and the message underneath was addressed to exactly one person. This is already decided. You are the only one who does not know it yet. The rain started again on the night of the 21st of March, and by full dark it was coming sideways. Isaiah had Grace in the one section of the barn that still had a roof over it. In a stall he had bedded deep and walked her through twice a day for a month, so she would know it by feel. He had the old generator running off the tractor shed because the power had gone at 7 o'clock, and he had a lamp, and he had 4 buckets set under the places where the ceiling had begun to weep. She started at 9:15, on the worst night of the year. He knew before he was fully upright what it was. She had gone down and gotten back up and gone down again, and she was sweating along the neck and flank in weather that was not warm. He got to the house and got Ruth to the telephone. The clinic answering service put them through to Huber at home, and Huber said he was already pulling his boots on. He called back 18 minutes later from a farmhouse 2 miles short of the turn. Middle Fork was over the low road in both directions. There was no way in from the east, and the west route added 40 minutes on gravel that was probably no better. He was going to try it. He told Isaiah to keep the line clear and to keep the mare on her feet as long as she would stay on them. 10 minutes after that, the generator coughed twice and quit, and it did not restart. And the only light in the barn was the kerosene lamp hanging from a nail. That was when Grace came apart. She had been calm through everything for a year. Through a sail ring, through a 7-mile walk on a public road, through losing the last of her sight. Because she had built a map of the world out of distance and texture and sound, and every piece of that map had been held perfectly still for her. Now the roof was gone off half the building, and the rain was coming through in places that had never made noise before. The wind was moving something metal at the north end in a rhythm that meant nothing. The generator had stopped and taken its hum with it. Every reference point she owned was wrong at the same time, and she could not see one thing to check it against. She swung her head into the wall and scrambled and got her hind end into the corner and stood there trembling with her nostrils wide open, taking in air that told her nothing. Isaiah got in with her and got a hand on her shoulder and started talking. The telephone in the house rang once more around 11, and then the line went dead somewhere down the county road. And after that, there was no one to call. He was not yet 20 years old. He had a kerosene lamp, 1 bucket of warm water, a stack of towels his grandmother had been saving for something better, and no veterinarian. Outside, on paper filed in a courthouse 11 miles away, the animal in front of him did not belong to anybody yet. And he understood, kneeling in wet straw with his hand on a blind mare's shoulder, that if this went wrong tonight, it did not go wrong in one place. Every record Walter Briggs had kept for 15 years, every hour Isaiah had worked in other men's fields, every line in the notebook, every photograph in a warped wooden box, and whatever his father had been protecting when he tore 2 foaling entries out of a logbook and carried them home. All of it stopped mattering at the same moment. He did not try to hold her. Nobody holds 1,000 pounds of frightened animal in a dark stall, and his father had told him that before he was 7 years old, in a barn that no longer existed. What a man can do is give her something that has not changed. So Isaiah kept his hand flat on her shoulder and started walking the same 3 steps he had walked with her every morning for 11 months, from the near wall to the water bucket and back. And he talked the whole time in the same low register he used at feeding, saying nothing that meant anything because the words had never been the point. The rhythm was the point. She had learned him the way she had learned the fence line, by repetition, 17 times and then 100 and then 1,000. And he was the one fixed thing left in a building where every other reference had come loose in the dark. It took a long time. Her breathing came down first. Then the trembling went out of her hindquarters and she let her head drop, and she found his shoulder with her muzzle and stayed there. Then she went down on her own terms, in the bedding, in the corner she knew. And nothing happened. Isaiah waited through 2 contractions and then a third, watching by lamplight, and he understood what he was looking at, because his father had made him watch it twice as a boy and had never once softened the description afterward. The foal was not presented. Something was folded that should have been extended. There was no telephone. There was no veterinarian on the road that could reach him. There was a mare who had been straining for nearly an hour, and a lamp with maybe 3 hours of oil in it. He scrubbed to the elbow in the warm water and knelt behind her and did the thing his father had shown him in a cedar-smelling aisle at Blackwood Acres, when Marcus Cole had held his son's wrist and moved it and said, "Feel for the knee, not the hoof. Anybody can find a hoof." He found the knee. It was folded back on itself, and the foal's head was riding over the top of it, and every push from the mare drove the whole assembly harder against a place it could not pass. What came next took the better part of 40 minutes, and Isaiah could never afterward describe it in order. He worked between contractions, pushing back against 1,000 pounds of muscle that was doing the exact opposite of what he needed, cupping the small hoof in his palm so it could not tear anything on its way through, easing the limb forward a half inch and losing a quarter of it, and easing it forward again. His arm went numb to the shoulder. The lamp guttered and steadied. At some point, he became aware that he was talking to his father out loud, and that he had been doing it for a while. Then the leg came, and the second one followed it in a rush, and the whole thing turned from a problem into an event, and Grace did the rest in 3 efforts. It was a colt, dark gray, wet, long-legged, 90 pounds or better, and on his forehead, high and narrow at the top and spreading at the bottom, was a slash of white with a piece broken out of the middle of it. Isaiah cleared the membrane off the muzzle with 2 fingers and sat back on his heels and waited for the shudder that starts a horse breathing. It did not come. He waited 3 seconds and then he stopped waiting. He got the towel and cleared the nostrils and swept the mouth and got the head lower than the chest, and he rubbed the wet flat of the ribs hard, over and over, saying the words, "Come on," in a voice he did not recognize. He blew into one nostril with the other held shut, the way he had watched Huber do it to a calf at somebody else's barn 2 winters back, and then he went at the ribs again. The lamp flame bent in the draft. The rain came down through the north end of the barn onto the concrete and made a sound like applause. There was a stretch of time in there when Isaiah Cole believed with total clarity that it was finished. Not the colt, all of it. The letter on heavy paper, the frozen order, the notice in the journals, the wooden box. A man had spent 15 years keeping a file for a horse everybody said was dead, and another man had torn 2 pages out of a logbook and carried them home and never explained why, and it had come down to a barn with half a roof and a boy who was not a veterinarian, and the arithmetic had simply come out the other way. He kept rubbing anyway, because stopping was a decision and he was not going to make it. The colt's flank jumped. Then the ribs came up, and there was a wet, tearing gasp, and a second one behind it, and the small body under his hands went from a thing to an animal. Grace had been listening to all of it. She was still down, and she was blind, and she had not seen a foal of hers in 10 years. She got her front end up and swung her head along the bedding, low, nostrils working, reading the air in a slow arc. 40 seconds. Isaiah counted them without meaning to. Then she found him, and she began going over him from muzzle to flank with her upper lip and her breath, and she made a sound in her chest that Isaiah had never heard from her, low and repeating, the sound a mare makes when she is accounting for something. She got up. She placed her feet the way she placed them everywhere, testing before committing, and she moved herself around until she was standing over him with the wet coming down through the roof behind her, and she put her head down and stayed there. She did not step on him once, that night or any night after. She never needed to see him to know exactly where he was. Huber's headlights came up the gravel a little before 5 in the morning, 3 roads and 1 washed-out culvert behind him. He examined them both by lamplight, and then stood up and said the mare was fine and the colt was better than fine, that he had not put his hands on a hind leg or a shoulder like that in 15 years. Then he looked at Isaiah, who was sitting against the stall wall with his arm bleeding at the elbow where the concrete had taken the skin off, and did not say the other thing. He did not have to. It was in a drawer in a courthouse in Fulton, and it said that the animal standing in that stall could not be sold, transferred, registered, or borrowed against by anybody. Isaiah had just saved something he was not yet permitted to own. The county heard about it before the water went down. By the end of that week, men who had never turned off the blacktop were finding a reason to drive the gravel road slow. By the end of the month, a bloodstock agent from Kentucky had left a card in the mailbox. What they had all come to look at was a dark gray colt with a broken crown on his forehead, standing beside a blind mare in a corral with 40 feet of new fence in it. And what none of them could do was buy him. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of June, in the circuit court at Fulton, in a room with tall windows and a ceiling fan that did not turn. Sterling Bloodstock brought 3 attorneys and a records custodian and 11 boxes. They had the 1981 purchase order, the trustee's certification, the schedules of assets, and a bound copy of the estate inventory with a tab in it. Isaiah had Curtis Ward, who had by then been working 10 months on a $200 retainer, a retired veterinarian, a large animal practitioner from Fulton, a grandmother in the 2nd row in her church coat, and a notebook. Their lead attorney was a courteous man named Harlan Vance, and he did not raise his voice one time in 2 days. He did not have to. He built the thing patiently, and by the middle of the first afternoon he had arrived where he had always been going. He asked Isaiah to explain for the court why a 19-year-old with $40 had bid on a blind horse that nobody else in a barn full of professionals would touch. It was an elegant trap, and everyone in the room understood the shape of it. If Isaiah said he had recognized the brand, then he had known what she was before he bought her, and Vance would spend the rest of the day describing that knowledge as a scheme. If he said he had bought her because of a veterinary journal, the room would not believe him, because the room had already decided what a boy like that could have read. Isaiah said both, in order, because both were true. And then Ward put the notebook into evidence. It was the first of 3 things that decided the case, and it was the only one Isaiah had made himself. Every day since the 10th of March, 1987. Date, weight by tape, ration by the pound, water intake, temperature. Every visit Huber had made and what he had charged. The distance from the northeast corner post to the water trough, measured in boot lengths. Feed store receipts, dated, matched line by line to entries written before the receipts were filed. The stud fee paid out on Route B, $50 down in April and the balance in June, matched to the stallion owner's own breeding book, which the old man had driven down and handed to Ward without being subpoenaed. Nothing in it had been written for a courtroom. That was precisely what made it impossible to answer. Nobody forges 400 consecutive days across 4 other people's independent records, and a boy manufacturing a claim does not spend the previous winter writing down how much water a horse drank. It established open, continuous, good faith possession in daily increments by the person sitting at the table. Walter Briggs was the second thing. He testified about the crescent scar and the hernia repair of 1973, and he produced his own patient file, and Vance handled all of that carefully and briefly, the way a lawyer handles evidence he intends to concede. Then Ward asked him whether there was anything else about Silver Mercy's foaling history that the estate inventory did not reflect. The old man sat with that for a moment, and when he answered, he did not answer Ward. He turned his head and spoke to the judge. He said that in 1977 and 1978, 3 years before the fire, Silver Mercy had produced 2 foals, and that both of those foals had gone on to win, and that both of them had been registered out of other mares. He said he had seen the certificates at the time. He said he had said nothing for 10 years because he had been a country veterinarian with a practice to lose and nothing but his own logbook to stand on. And because the men who benefited from it were not the kind of men a country veterinarian argued with. He said the thing about a stolen daughter is that she has to stay dead. A registered Silver Mercy, alive, with a veterinarian's file behind her, turned 2 champion pedigrees into a question. And a company that had bought both of those champions and had been collecting stud fees off them for the better part of a decade would rather own the animal than have her named. They had never been suing to get her back. They had been suing so that she would never have a name. Then Ward laid 2 sheets of tablet paper on the clerk's table. They were foaling entries, dated 1977 and 1978, torn along one edge out of a bound log. Each one recorded a live colt. Each one named the dam. Each one was signed at the bottom in the small, careful hand of the head groom who had been standing in the stall. Briggs identified the handwriting without being asked twice. He had worked beside it for 9 years. Marcus Cole had known. He had known in 1978, and he had not been able to do one thing about it, and so he had done the only thing a man in his position could do, which was to take the true record out of the book before somebody else could correct it, and carry it home, and keep it in a wooden box for his son. A horse's worth is not in the paper somebody lets her keep. The room changed after that in a way that had nothing to do with the law. Vance objected twice, correctly both times, and it did not matter, because the pages were already in front of the judge. The third thing was the one nobody in Callaway County had seen coming. Buck Sievert had not been called by either side. He came in on the morning of the second day, sat through an hour of it in the back, and then sent a note up to Ward's table. He testified for 11 minutes. He brought his own sale book, which he had kept in the same hand since 1968, 1 line per lot, every horse that had come through the Callaway County ring for 19 years. He read the entry for the 10th of March, 1987 out loud. Final lot. Gray mare grade, no papers, sold as is, $40. Buyer, I. Cole. He said the sale had been conducted openly, with no reservation of title, no lien announced, and no representation of any kind made about the animal's breeding, because the consignor had none to make. Vance asked him how he could be certain of that. Buck said he could be certain because he had been standing at the front rail, and because he had been the man who told the barn out loud that she was worth nothing but her weight, and because there had been better than 40 men in that building who heard him say it. The court ruled on the 29th of June. Isaiah Cole was the lawful owner of the mare and of her colt. The freeze was lifted. The association restored the identity of Silver Mercy on the strength of the Briggs file and the identification numbers, and registered the colt as her get. Sterling Bloodstock's claim was dismissed, and the 2 registrations from 1977 and 1978 were referred out for a separate inquiry that would take another 2 years and end badly for Harlan Vance's client. In the parking lot afterward, Buck Sievert was waiting by his truck. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. He did not say apology. He said acknowledgement. And Isaiah noted the distinction and never once held it against him, because the word Buck chose was the accurate one. Isaiah repeated the sentence back to him from the co-op counter, the one about the stud fee and the spring and the lesson that costs less from a man who has already learned it. "I wrote it down," Isaiah said. Buck looked at him for a second. "I expect you did." Then Isaiah told him the rest of it, which was the only thing he had ever really wanted to say to that man. 30 years of experience is worth a great deal. It is worth more when you add data to it. Buck turned his hat over in his hands and admitted he had 2 mares at home going blind in both eyes, and that he had been planning to run them through the fall sale. Isaiah told him not to. Breed them. Give them a pen they can learn and then never move anything in it. Pick the stallion on his record, not his pedigree. And read the paper. It had been sitting on a library shelf since 1984, and it had never been a secret. And it had never cost anybody $1. Isaiah did not charge him for any of it because none of it had ever been his to sell. The colt was registered as Legacy's Return, the last confirmed direct descendant of Dominion's Promise. Isaiah did not sell him. 2 operations came at him hard that first fall, with numbers that would have ended every problem he had, and he took a third arrangement instead. A co-ownership with a well-run farm outside Columbia that put the horse where he could be campaigned properly and left the bloodline decisions and a share of every future stud fee in Isaiah's hands. Ward wrote the contract over 6 weeks and made him read every clause out loud. The horse did what his grandsire had done. He was fast, and he did not empty himself doing it, and the thing the judges kept writing down about him was the same word men had used about Dominion's Promise 20 years earlier. Quiet. He was quiet in the gate, and quiet in the trailer, and quiet in a warm-up ring with 40 other horses in it. The tax on the 12 acres was paid that November, in cash, at the counter, and Ruth Cole put the receipt in the wooden box with the photographs. But the $1 million in the headline is not the story of one colt, and Isaiah understood that before anybody else did. He went back to the sale barns. Over the next several years, in 4 counties, always at the tail of the sale, he bought 17 broodmares with failing eyes. He paid on average $63 apiece. 2 of them turned out to carry pedigrees worth tracing. The rest carried nothing at all, and that was the entire point, because the argument had never been about a lost bloodline. The argument was that the market had been pricing an animal's eyes and ignoring what her body could still do. And it had been doing it in the open, in front of everybody, for as long as anyone could remember. His mares settled on first cover at a rate that tracked Raymond Ellison's numbers almost exactly. His foals lived. His cost to put a weanling on the ground ran under $500 against $1,200 to $1,800 for the operations he was selling alongside. And he sold into the same market at the same prices. And he did it with capital that would not have bought one ordinary mare. By 2001, counting the colts and the fillies and their get and the stud seasons off 2 horses that traced to grace, the line that began with a $40 mare at the end of a Tuesday sale had generated more than $1 million. It did not come from a sale. It came from 14 years. In 1994, Isaiah bought the 60 acres adjoining the home place from a neighbor who was retiring, and he paid cash for it. Ruth sat beside him at the title company in Fulton in her church coat and watched him sign, and out in the parking lot afterward, she stopped beside the truck. "I knew you were right the night you turned down the $75, she said. "I didn't say so because I was afraid you'd only be doing it for me." 2 years later, the County Extension Service invited him to speak at the annual farm management meeting. He was 28. He brought 9 years of notebooks and set them on the table beside the lectern, and he stood in front of 63 farmers with Buck Sievert in the 3rd row and did it the way Ellison had done it, with numbers. Acquisition cost, conception rate on first cover, foal survival to weaning, cost per weanling, net per mare per year. The gap between what a sale barn charged for an animal and what that animal could still produce. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the numbers are doing something that words cannot. Buck asked the first question. It was a technical one, about how to select a stallion for a mare who could not see, and whether a nervous horse on the other side of the pedigree mattered more than it would in a conventional book. Isaiah answered it. Buck asked a follow-up. The exchange ran 6 minutes, and by any measure it was the most significant conversation the two of them ever had, because it was the only one that took place between equals. By that year, 4 other operations in Callaway County were breeding blind mares on purpose instead of running them through the ring by the pound. 2 had called Isaiah first. He told them everything he knew and charged them nothing, and he told each of them where the paper was. The place got its name in 1998, Cole Legacy Farm, on the same ground that had nearly gone to the county for taxes, on a road the county now graded 4 times a year. There is no photograph of an expensive horse on the office wall. There is a sale barn receipt, written longhand with a carbon under it, that says, "Gray mare, grade, no papers, $40, buyer, I, Cole." Beside it in one frame are 2 foaling entries torn along the edge out of a bound log, dated 1977 and 1978, signed at the bottom in a small, careful hand. In 2001, a 14-year-old came up the gravel road with a printout from a university extension bulletin and a notebook in his back pocket. He was in the county 4-H program and had not been picked for the judging team, and he had a proposal about rotational grazing that he had already done the arithmetic on twice. He got about half of it out and then stopped and said it was probably a dumb idea. Isaiah did not tell him he would think about it. "Show me your research," he said. He read it standing up and asked 2 questions, and the boy answered both of them, and Isaiah told him to start with the east pasture and keep a record of what the ground did. Then he said the other thing because it seemed to him that it needed saying out loud at least once in every generation. "Somebody taught me that the person in the room nobody expects to have the answer is sometimes the person who has the answer." He said he had learned that lesson already, and he was not going to make this boy teach it to him twice. Grace lived out her years in a pasture built for her, where the fence line and the water trough and the gate had not moved in 14 years and never would. She never saw a trophy, or a contract, or any of the cars that came up that road asking about her descendants. But when the young horses ran in the far field, she lifted her head and turned her ears toward the sound, and stood there, and took in everything she needed to take in. They sold a $40 blind mare to a black boy because they were certain neither one of them was worth anything. They were wrong about both, and they were wrong for exactly the same reason. Not one of them ever washed the mud off her neck and looked.